Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to talk about red meat and health, and I'm hopefully going to have enough time at the end a little bit to talk about what we're doing at the Nutrition Coalition to let you all know more about that. So first thing to know is I have never presented this material, and I finished it at 2 o'clock in the morning, so just be nice to me and smile, please. Okay, so red meat, it's clearly like the third rail of nutrition. There's just so much bad news out there about red meat, and this is just a selection of things you can find on the internet, but there's also mainstream publications, the New York Times, the Atlantic Magazine, just a constant drumbeat of articles about how red meat is bad for health. And you see this, the immediate past president of the American College of Cardiology said everybody should be a vegan for heart health. Harvard, I would say, publishes a paper once every half a year or so about, against meat. The British Medical Journal recently editorialized about meat, saying it was like smoking cigarettes. So it's really serious, the claims against red meat. And I'm going to go over just 3 of them. All of these have been proposed by various top experts in the field. And the first one is red meat and diabetes. And that is all I'm going to say on red meat and diabetes. Okay, next up. Okay, red meat and colorectal cancer. That's cancer of your colon and rectum. So red meat has been accused of being connected to many kinds of cancers, but this is really the one that has risen to the top, and that's because in 2015, IARC, which is the International something or other, but it's part of the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they decide what causes cancer. And so they decided to look at red meat, and this is what they found. They found that fresh meat, like steak, was a probable cause of cancer, and that processed meats like bacon and sausage were a convincing cause of cancer. That's in the same category as cigarettes. So, and the coverage of this was really resounded all over the world. What was the evidence? They published a 2-page paper in Lancet Oncology about their findings, and they said a 17% increased risk between red meat and cancer, colorectal cancer, and an 18% between processed meat and colorectal cancer. It doesn't seem like a big difference to me, and those are both small numbers to begin with, but anyway, those were their findings. And they were supposed to publish a full dossier about all of the papers that they reviewed and what those papers said, and they reviewed apparently 800 papers, and they were supposed to publish that. Normally in science what happens is that the papers are sent out before they're published, right, to journalists, and you have like a week to look at it, ask other scientists, what do you think, and then you write an article that is, when the embargo is lifted, that can be a balanced coverage of that science. That did not happen here. They published this, and 2.5 years later, they still have not published the scientific rationale for their decision. I mean, the foundation of it. So given what we know, which is very little, what are the foundations of the data here? Well, that 17 and 18% is all based on epidemiology, which is a kind of science that is very weak. It shows association, not causation. What could go wrong with epidemiology? Well, I mean, these are just, you can find so many hilarious examples of epidemiology of things that are really well correlated. So don't consume margarine if you're from Maine and you want to stay married. Or it seems like maybe that's a really good way to get rid of your husband if you here's another. You just find all these false positives. Okay, here internet user using the internet causes breast cancer. You can find a million things like this, and scientists have actually done kind of joke experiments where they looked at people's horoscope and correlated it with all kinds of diseases with the same strength of association and dose-response relationship that you find in the published literature. So that's one limitation of the data. in epidemiology, it's not like you can never use epidemiology to show cause and effect, but it really depends on a number of criteria. The most important one is the strength of the association. So what was the strength of the association between red meat and cancer? So first of all, the great success story of epidemiology is heavy smokers, people who are heavy smokers compared to never smokers, and heavy smokers had a 15 to 30-fold increased risk of getting lung cancer compared to never smokers. That's considered the great success of epidemiology. Compare that to the numbers they found for meat. 1.1 compared to 15 to 30. And in general, what people who care about the standards of evidence say you should never look at a relative risk lower than 2, because there's just too much possibility that there will be confounding and bias that come into it. So what is confounding? Well, confounding on studies with red meat looks like this. People who eat red meat are just less healthier in a whole bunch of other ways. All of those things listed there, because you have to think about it, like other than the low-carb, high-fat paleo community, who is eating red meat? Those are the people who aren't listening to anything their doctors are telling them, or maybe not going to their doctors. The advice not to eat red meat is one of the top of the list, anything your doctor will tell you. So those are people who are doing a lot of things that they're not what we call adherers. People who adhere to advice are just healthy in a whole lot of ways that we can really never measure. And red meat people who eat red meat are non-adherers on the whole. Except for you guys. You guys are doing great. Okay, other thing about epidemiology in nutrition is especially poor. Many people know this. It all relies on these self-reported food frequency questionnaires that have 200 plus questions like how many peaches did you have in the last 6 months? How many apricots did you have in the last 6 months? And then you have to figure out, I had lasagna last night. What is that? I don't even know how my husband made that or what was in it. And so these are just notoriously unreliable as a source of data. They've actually been tested when they actually go in and see what people are eating, and then they test it against their food frequency questionnaire, and they find out that the quality of this data is very poor. And that's in the published literature. But they still depend on these. Just to show you why epidemiology can be so dangerous when it comes to making policy. These are some of the spectacular failures of epidemiology. These were all basically public health recommendations adopted on the basis of the epidemiology that when they were finally tested properly in randomized controlled clinical trials, which is how you show cause and effect, they showed that these interventions didn't work or were even harmful. Hormone replacement therapy was killing women. Antioxidant vitamins also had, I think it's vitamin E, where they found they had higher rates of heart disease. So it tells you, let's not rely on epidemiology. So what did IARC do for the WHO decision? They relied entirely on epidemiology. This is the pyramid of evidence. You can see, epidemiology is properly at the lower end of the pyramid, and trials are up towards the top. Well, what about clinical trials on red meat and cancer? Are there any? In fact, there are. But they were not considered by IARC. Here's a big one. The polyp prevention trial funded by the National Institutes of Health. It was designed specifically to look at colorectal cancer. It was a clinical trial, and it was a big one and long one. And they could find no effect of decreasing meat on the prevention of the reoccurrence of these polyps, which is a measure of your cancer. And there's this trial, NIH funded, also 49,000 women, designed again as a cancer trial, right? That was the primary outcome they were looking at. And they reduced red meat significantly in the intervention group compared to the controls, and that's the chart showing the effect of, that's the control group versus the intervention group and their rates of cancer, and they look exactly the same. No effect. Well, So I was actually lucky enough just this week to see a presentation by one of the panelists. So there were maybe 25 panelists on this IARC committee who was deciding about red meat and cancer, and one of them gave a talk earlier this week. His name is David Klurfeld. I've cleared it with him to talk about these points. And he said that he presented this clinical trial research and said, why are we not considering this more rigorous body of evidence? And they said, we're not set up to look at clinical trials. Because most of the things they look at are toxins. You don't do experiments on toxins, right? But and they just ignored that data. And they also said it was, and this is a fair point, it's that it was multifactorial. So in both those trials, people not only reduced red meat, but they reduced fat, they ate more fruits and vegetables, they did a lot of things. So it's not specifically a trial on red meat. And that is true. But if red meat were driving cancer and you reduce red meat and you see no effect on cancer, that is a pretty strong indication that red meat does not cause cancer. So what were some of the other limitations of the process that I heard from David Klurfeld, who is a scientist at USDA? The panel only looked at 23 papers for its conclusions, not the 800 as claimed. The majority of the IARC panel had spent the past 20 plus years publishing papers against red meat. That is bias. Remember, when you're talking about what messes with results in epidemiology, one of them is bias. And the IARC staff leaders and many of the panelists were vegetarians. And when he asked them, don't you think you should disclose that as a conflict of interest, they said, why? So that's a terrible story for science. And what were the proposed mechanisms for red meat causing cancer? You have to have an explanation about how red meat causes cancer. I'm just going to go over the two top ones that were most convincing to the panel itself, okay? The first one is heme iron. This is one you'll hear. Heme iron is the factor in red meat that causes cancer. So this is what I learned from David Klurfeld. The studies that heme iron mechanism rely upon were on rats who were fed blood sausage. Okay, do you know what's in blood sausage? It's 80% blood. And it does not necessarily include any meat at all. They only observed the damaging effects on calcium-deficient diets, and that those effects went away when they gave them enough calcium. And that two other papers by the same researcher had found the rats fed they did another experiment. They found rats fed bacon had lower damaging compounds, but he did not submit those papers. I mean, bacon compared to other proteins. And he wouldn't talk about them. So the other mechanism that's convincing to people are the N-nitroso compounds. That's what they're called. And he said that a toxicologist, one of the main toxicologists at the meeting, stood up and said, these N-nitroso compounds that you're feeding these lab animals, you're feeding them at levels that are a multitude of what humans actually eat. And therefore, it's really an exaggeration of the data. And the chair of the panel said, shut up and sit down. Okay, there's actually been so much concern about this IARC decision that Lancet Oncology, this is now about 8 months after the decision, came out with an editorial saying, we really need to question the IARC process. It's just that there's a problem with reliable findings. I mean, the IARC really, pretty much, I don't know how, somebody did a study on this, I think it's John Ioannidis, where he looked at the 300 things that IARC had examined to see if they caused cancer, and every single one of them they decided caused cancer. So there's concern about the process here. However, this IARC decision has proven to be extremely powerful. So on the basis of that decision, the American Medical Association decided there should be no more processed meat in hospitals anymore. So that's no more salami or sausages or anything. And there's now a lawsuit that's been started by an animal welfare group trying to ban processed meat in LA schools. So that's where things stand on red meat and cancer. Red meat and heart disease. Okay, they're correlated. Heart disease has dropped in coincidence with red meat. I wish we had this data to go back to like 1900 because we used to eat way more meat in 1900 when heart disease was non-existent. But anyways, we'll just stick with this to be fair. This is the data that we have. So let's remember, why did we ever think that red meat caused heart disease? Was the diet heart hypothesis. It was all based on the idea that red meat had saturated fat and cholesterol in it. And we now know from, if you were at the talk yesterday, that that hypothesis, the diet heart hypothesis, has been really rigorously tested in tens of thousands of people in government-funded trials in well-controlled settings, and the conclusion is that there is no effect on saturated fats or cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. And that's also, and that's, you know, there are lists of all those reviews on the Nutrition Coalition website if you want to look them up. But Cochrane is one of them. So what about red meat just by itself causing heart disease? Let's not look at the saturated fats and cholesterol. Let's just look at red meat. And so there have been a number of meta-analyses that have been done on the clinical trial literature. That's the more rigorous kind of literature, and they cannot find any negative effect of red meat on your cholesterol markers or inflammatory markers. So that's one review, and this is another review that came out. They could not find any negative effect. And this is, poor guy, this is a bad picture, but I just didn't tell you, I met this researcher, and I know a little bit about his studies, but I didn't have the right ones to cite, but I want to tell you his findings are very interesting. He finds that he's done studies on lean meat versus regular full-fat meat, and he finds that people's lipid markers look better. What do you think? How many people think lean meat? Not the lean meat, good. People look better and their HDL rises more on regular meat. Okay, so we find that red meat doesn't really seem to cause cancer, it doesn't seem to really cause heart disease, it doesn't cause diabetes, yet it still causes death. By what mechanism? We don't know. Okay. And this is a study out of NIH. This woman here is Dr. Sinha. She's one of these people who spent her entire career trying to prove that red meat causes cancer. 67 papers on red meat since 1995. And they all show that red meat seemed to be bad for health. And she was also on the IARC panel. So you'll notice that what she thinks causes, her new mechanism is nitrates, and that's apparently what causes death. And here's a study showing that the most nitrates that humans are exposed to are from vegetables, and moreover, there's quite a bit of literature to show that they're not bad for health. Still, again, the expert community is chugging along with the anti-meat publications, and now even if the data doesn't show it's bad for health, there's kind of a drive to show that it's just bad for the planet. So now I have to switch to show you, where does that come from? Why is there so much anti-red meat energy? It's partly these biased researchers, but it's also partly this, which is that there is now a tremendous push from very well-funded, very well-organized activist groups. They really do not want people eating any kind of animal food at all. And they have kind of made broken bread with the environmental groups who are convinced that cows cause global warming. And are not sustainable. They consume too many of the planet's resources. It's the idea of a pound of plants versus a pound of meat. Meat costs more to produce, but I always say, but if a pound of plants comes with diabetes, obesity, heart disease, okay, what do those really look like now? Okay, there's also the vegetarian diet doctors. These guys are they are very active. They're very well funded. Some of them are not really mainly about diet. These guys have spent their entire life in animal welfare. And this guy, David Katz, is my favorite. Not just because he said I'm an animal unlike anything he's ever seen to a Guardian reporter, but he does have amazing conflicts of interest. He is just paid. He's really paid by the carbohydrate companies. These come from an article on the Russell's blog, which you can look up, and he is really one of the ringleaders of this idea of the plant-based diet. I mean, he organizes all these people together, and their idea is a plant-based diet for all. They don't want to tolerate any other diets. And this is what he said just like yesterday at a vegetarian conference. So you guys, you can be on your keto diet, or you can go binge on cocaine. Same thing. But all these folks, or you can do both. I don't know how you catch cholera. But these folks are incredibly powerful, and they have a lot of money, and they've persuaded a lot of people. And as we just heard, how powerful films are. They've done these 2 movies. There's a great, well, I wouldn't say great. I mean, I did it. So there's an analysis on the dietdoctor.com of what the heck. Thank you. I would say it was a rigorous effort to analyze all the health claims in What the Health, that movie. So in sum, I would say there's good news and bad news about this. The good news is for meat. There is no rigorous evidence, no clinical trial evidence to show that meat is bad for health in any way. And I won't even get into all the things that are beneficial about meat. It's very nutrient dense. It's a low-calorie source of protein. I would recommend for that going to the blog of Georgia Ede, EDE, who has done a fantastic job, I think, of going through some of those issues. The bad news, of course, is for science. It's just terrible. It's just terrible science. And it really is sad to see how that's happening. This is just to remind us, we evolved eating meat. We had a positive view of domesticated animals. Those are, domesticated animals were taken to Athena. It's on the Parthenon, on the friezes of the Parthenon. And humans had respect for their animals, and they were a valued part of human existence. And this is us now. So that's it on red meat and health. So I think I'm okay for time to talk about the Nutrition Coalition. Okay. So the Nutrition Coalition is a group that I founded in 2015, really looking at the expert report for the dietary guidelines that had come out. The dietary guidelines come out every 5 years. My book had just come out, and I look at this expert report, and I read the whole horrible 481 pages, and I thought, where's the science? Where's all the science on the low-carb diet? Not there. Where's the science on saturated fats? It's like all the reconsideration of saturated fats that's gone on in the last 5 years. Where is it? It's not there. And having spent nearly a decade researching science for my book and seeing how much bad science there is out there, terrible science. I mean, authors just denying their data or lying about their data. I have to say that report is possibly some of the worst science I have ever seen. So trying to think about, as we all do, how do we create change? We can try to convince our family members, our friends. We can take, stacks of material to our doctors. But I realized that really what we have to do is change the dietary guidelines. This slide is just a draft, so it's not really, it's not done yet. But you have to understand the dietary guidelines. There should be arrows pointing down here, how influential they are. Really all across America. They determine the military rations. They determine the U.S. food supply because, once the dietary guidelines started, all cattle started being bred leaner, low food started. They actually told food manufacturers, please start creating. We need thousands more low-fat foods. It determines how the food fact panel looks, and everybody flips over their packaged foods to see what's on their food. And food manufacturers will design foods in order to have a certain look on the food fact panel. That's an incredible thing. They'll basically decide the number of grams, the number of saturated fat grams, the number of total fat, and then they will reverse engineer to what the product might be, like a low-fat chocolate dairy product. I think most importantly, the dietary guidelines are really just downloaded to all these medical professional groups, and they go out to the doctor's office and the nutritionist's office and the dietitian's office, and all of those practitioners just give you the guidelines, give people the guidelines. Everybody on the front line of healthcare is delivered the guidelines. And as I mentioned yesterday, it's quite true that in large medical practices, doctors are forbidden for giving any advice that is contrary to the guidelines because their group that they're in fears medical malpractice should they go against the gold standard guidelines. There's one medical doctor who wrote to me about how she takes my plate, which is the guidelines graphic, and she just puts a big X through half of it. And that's the way she delivers the guidelines, without breaking the rules. And also all the USDA feeding programs, that number should be 1 in 4 Americans consume one of these meals every month. And they affect our children, our elderly. It is one of the biggest budget items outside the military in the U.S. budget. So there's really nothing, there's a tremendous rigidity here. This is the important thing to understand. None of this can change until the guidelines change. So it seems impossible to change the guidelines, but that is truly what has to be done. And this is just a chart to show how great the guidelines have been for America. Again, because they're so powerful. I understand this is a correlation, not causation, but it's very suggestive. So how are the guidelines wrong? The guidelines are the 3 dietary patterns, which is what they currently have. They are all high carb. They say they have a range of diets, but they all look exactly the same. And you can see in 1965, all of America was basically on what we would now call a low-carb diet. We were all low-carbers, we just didn't know it. Other ways the guidelines are wrong. If you follow them to a T, they're nutritionally insufficient. You will not get all the nutrients you need. And the only reason that this doesn't look way worse is that they still recommend 5 servings a day of refined grains. And because they are enriched and fortified in folate and B vitamins and iron, and otherwise, if you're not eating your refined grains, you're not getting those nutrients either. And let's just not even talk about how the fact that your body does not absorb those enriched supplements as well as it does when you get them from real food. And through some information, this Freedom of Information Act FOIA information I got, I found that the 2015 committee had actually tried to reduce refined grains because, their top line message is eat whole grains, and they wanted to reduce refined grains, but they found they couldn't because they would be even more nutritionally insufficient. So the dietary guidelines currently recommend equal amounts of refined grains and whole grains. And just remember, that's what's being served in school, that's what's in the military, that's when it's in elderly homes. Okay, other things. They recommend 27 grams of vegetable oils every day, limits on saturated fats, and lean meat and low-fat dairy. So what has the Nutrition Coalition done so far? Well, in 2015, I basically went around and talked to members of Congress. Remember, the guidelines are going on. Everybody's concerned about the guidelines, all newspaper articles and everything. We decided, let's go in and take advantage of this attention on the guidelines and put in place something that will prevent this happening again in the next go-around of the guidelines, which are in 2020. So we convinced Congress to appropriate, or we were among the people who convinced Congress to appropriate $1 million for really the first ever outside peer review of the guidelines. They'd never been peer reviewed by any outside source. And this was done by the National Academy of Medicine. It came out, the report came out last fall, and it had a bunch of strong language in it. which was great. The guidelines lack scientific rigor. They don't use state-of-the-art systematic reviews. All this language is fantastic because it allows us now to move forward on the 2020 guidelines with this authority at our backs, right? And USDA has already gone through a set of listening sessions to say, we need to respond to this report. So everybody's taking this report very seriously, which is wonderful. Another, I would say, of our successes is that the USDA just announced this week that is starting the 2020 guideline process by soliciting they want feedback for the first time in order to increase transparency, which was one of the National Academy of Medicine recommendations. They are asking the public to send in comments about topics that they have decided are the most important topics to review. So instead of reviewing all the science, like they try to do every 5 years, they're just going to focus on certain topics to review. And in their list of topics are low carbohydrate diets. Okay. So they just put this in the dietary patterns. This is not a dietary pattern, but they just snuck it in there. And also saturated fats. Yeah. Between friends, I would like to, I know I can't really take credit for this, but when I was asked to submit testimony to USDA, this was exactly what I said. I said, you must focus on certain topics that are disputed, and these are the topics. So I'm sure lots of other people were saying that too. But anyway, it's in there now. So what can you do, all of us? One of the things that we want for the guidelines, at least do no harm. For the medical doctors out there, you understand, at least don't make us fat and sick. So, so we have this petition, which is what we have is a number of points that are all about, that's just what are the existing dietary recommendations that are not supported by the evidence, like the limits on saturated fats. And so we have this petition. Please sign it. forbetterdietaryguidelines.org. Also, you can sign up for our newsletter, which I said yesterday, but something was wrong with our website. Now it's fixed. You can, we're at nutritioncoalition.us. You can subscribe on that other button. The other red button is donate. Feel free to donate. And also, please submit a comment to USDA. What do you think they should review about saturated fats or low carbohydrate diets? Or please submit a comment. This post that will talk about what I just spoke about and give you the link to where you can make your public comment is on the homepage of our website. Also, we're going to start hosting screenings of this movie, The Magic Pill. I mean, I think it's such a good point how powerful movies are. They really do change minds. This is the one that, there's a screening of it tonight. It's a really moving film, and I think it's very powerful. Those cities are ones where we would especially like to have people to host it. It's the hosting. The whole process of hosting is organized by a company that makes it completely easy. They give you all the information, and you use their software to get people to sign up. And so you just have to give it some energy and passion, and host a screening of that movie, and we will help you do that. Our goal is to use a scientific method, stop obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases in America. And imagine a disease-free America if we can really pull this off, which I think we can do, all of us together. So thank you. I appreciate your help.